Rachel's heart swelled with anticipation when her phone buzzed. Mom flashed across the screen. She hesitated only for a second before answering. Maybe, just maybe, this year would be different. "Hey, Mom," she greeted, cradling the phone between her shoulder and ear as she wiped down the kitchen counter. The aroma of cinnamon and vanilla still lingered in the air from the cookies she had baked with Sophia and Caleb earlier. "Rachel," her mother's voice was warm, measured. "I wanted to talk to you about Thanksgiving." Rachel's heart lifted. Despite the past, she always held on to the hope that family could be more. She envisioned a big dinner, her children laughing at the table, her father carving the turkey while Matthew and his wife Olivia made small talk. She had grown up with an unshakable awareness that she and Matthew weren't treated the same, but she had spent years convincing herself it didn't matter. That as long as she tried hard enough, as long as she was the good daughter, she could fix the distance between them. This could be the year. "I'd love to come," Rachel said quickly, before her mother could change her mind. "Sophia and Caleb have been so excited." Sophia even drew a little picture of all of us sitting together at the table. There was a beat of silence. A hesitation. "Actually, honey," her mother began, her tone taking on an artificial softness that sent a chill down Rachel's spine. "I was thinking, maybe it would be best if the kids stayed home this year." Rachel blinked. "What?" "Just for Thanksgiving," her mother rushed to add. "You know how energetic they can be. It might be hard to keep things calm, and I want this year to be a little more relaxed." Rachel's grip on the phone tightened. "Mom, they're 4 and 7. They're supposed to be energetic. And it's Thanksgiving. It's a family holiday." "I know, sweetheart," her mother sighed, as if Rachel were the one being unreasonable. "But I thought you'd understand. It's just for one evening. We can do something special with them another time." Another time. Rachel's mind reeled. Why now? Why this year? Then it hit her. "Matthew's kids are coming, aren't they?" The words tumbled out before she could stop them. A pause, the kind that confirmed everything she feared. "Well, yes. But they're older, Rachel. They know how to sit still and not make a mess. And they don't." "Don't what, Mom?" Rachel's voice wavered, but she refused to let it break. "Don't act like kids? Don't exist in a way that inconveniences you." "That's not what I'm saying," her mother replied sharply, patience slipping. "You're overreacting." Rachel squeezed her eyes shut. The years of quiet slights, of backhanded compliments, of being the one expected to make sacrifices while Matthew coasted without question, all of it flooded back at once. She had spent her entire life trying to earn a seat at the table. And now, her children were being cast aside just as she had been. It wasn't about their energy levels. It was about something deeper, something uglier. It was about who mattered. Rachel forced herself to take a breath, but the pain in her chest was relentless. "I can't believe this," she whispered. "Oh, Rachel," her mother sighed. "I just thought you'd understand." Understand? Understand what? That her children weren't as valued as Matthew's? That they were an inconvenience to be managed rather than family to be cherished? A sharp, bitter laugh escaped her lips. "No, Mom. I don't understand. And I never will." Her mother hesitated, as if considering whether to push further. Then, in a tone so casual it made Rachel's stomach turn, she added, "So you'll still come, right?" Rachel's breath caught. That was it. She wasn't expected to push back. She never had been. She was expected to swallow her pride, to comply, to accept her role as second best. But this time, it wasn't just her. It was Sophia and Caleb. Rachel's eyes burned as she glanced toward the living room, where Sophia sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully coloring in the Thanksgiving drawing she had made earlier. Caleb was beside her, giggling as he tried to balance a stuffed bear on his head. They deserved better. And she wasn't going to let them grow up feeling this same hollowness she had. "No," Rachel said finally, voice steady. "If my kids aren't welcome, then I'm not either." Her mother let out a sharp breath, clearly taken aback. "Rachel, don't be dramatic." "I'm not," she said, surprising even herself with the certainty in her tone. "I'm making a choice." There was a long pause on the other end. Then, with a clipped finality, her mother said, "Well, that's your decision." And then, before Rachel could respond, before she could find the right words to fully express the heartbreak, the anger, the weight of it all, her mother hung up. Rachel stared at the phone in her hand, listening to the empty silence of the disconnected call. She felt a numbness settle over her, cold and heavy. For years, she had convinced herself that if she just tried harder, if she proved herself over and over again, maybe, things would change. But they never had. And they never would. A lump formed in her throat as she turned back toward the living room. Caleb, still giggling, toppled over onto the floor, his stuffed bear tumbling after him. Sophia looked up from her drawing, bright-eyed. "Mommy, are we going to Grandma's for Thanksgiving?" Rachel swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "No, sweetheart," she said softly. "We're going to do something even better." And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't just saying it to convince herself. She meant it. Rachel stood in her kitchen, the silence pressing in around her. The phone, still gripped in her hand, felt heavier than it should. She replayed the conversation with her mother over and over, each word slicing deeper. Her children weren't welcome. She had been prepared for disappointment. She always was when it came to her family, but this was a new level of rejection, one that left her breathless. Her mother's words had been so casual, so dismissive, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to exclude Rachel's children from a family gathering. As if it were perfectly reasonable to suggest that she attend without them. And then, as if the knife wasn't already buried deep enough, the expectation had still remained. "So you'll still come, right?" Rachel gritted her teeth. The sheer audacity of it all made her stomach churn. For years, she had ignored the small injustices, the favoritism, the unspoken rules that dictated that Matthew's family always came first. She had swallowed her feelings, forced smiles, and played the role of the understanding daughter. But this was the moment that shattered the last remnants of her patience. A small voice in her head told her to call back, to try again, to explain why this was unacceptable. Maybe if she phrased it differently, her mother would see reason. Maybe she could make her understand how much this hurt. But deep down, Rachel knew the truth. Her mother would never see it. Because she didn't want to. The sound of tiny footsteps broke through her thoughts. She turned to see Sophia standing in the doorway, her coloring book clutched in her hands. "Mommy?" Rachel forced a smile, hoping her daughter couldn't see the storm raging inside her. "Yes, sweetheart." Sophia hesitated. "Did Grandma say what time we should come for Thanksgiving?" Rachel's throat tightened. The excitement in her daughter's voice was a painful reminder of just how much she had wanted this. How much they had wanted this. Rachel knelt down, gently brushing a stray curl from Sophia's face. "Actually, sweetheart, we're going to do something different this year." Sophia's brows furrowed. "Different how?" Rachel stood in the kitchen, her fingers still curled around the edge of the countertop. The weight of the past few hours pressed down on her, but something inside her had shifted. It was subtle at first, like a crack in the walls she had spent years reinforcing. But now, as she listened to the distant sound of Sophia and Caleb giggling in the next room, the crack was growing, widening, letting in something she hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. The argument with her mother had left her shaken. Matthew's condescending dismissal had stung. But now that the dust was settling, something became painfully, beautifully clear. She didn't need them. She had spent years trying to earn a love that came with conditions, bending over backward to be the perfect daughter, the one who was reliable, the one who understood. And for what? To be pushed aside when it suited them? She turned toward the doorway where Sophia and Caleb sat cross-legged on the floor, their markers scattered around them. Sophia was hunched over her drawing, tongue poking out in concentration, while Caleb was gleefully sticking star-shaped stickers all over his arms. Rachel's chest ached. She had spent so much time trying to be the daughter her parents wanted that she had nearly forgotten the most important role of all. She was their mother. And they deserved better. She took a slow, steady breath and stepped forward. "Okay, Guys, she said, clapping her hands together. We're going to have the best Thanksgiving ever. Sophia perked up immediately. Like, a super-duper special one? Even better, Rachel promised. Caleb gasped. With pie? Rachel laughed. Of course with pie. Sophia grinned, her earlier disappointment about Grandma's house long forgotten. Can we make decorations? Rachel nodded. Absolutely. And mashed potatoes? You're the head chef, remember? Sophia giggled, bouncing on her knees. This is gonna be so fun. Caleb clapped his tiny hands together. Best giving ever. Rachel smiled, warmth blooming in her chest. Yes, it would be. The rest of the evening passed in a whirlwind of plans and laughter. Sophia insisted on making a Thanksgiving list, carefully writing down everything they would need: turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, lots and lots of pie, and something she called happiness cake, which Rachel suspected was just an excuse to make cupcakes. Caleb, determined to contribute, drew what he claimed was a turkey but looked suspiciously like a dinosaur with feathers. Rachel watched them, her heart swelling. This was Thanksgiving. Not the stiff, formal dinners where she had to tiptoe around her mother's expectations. Not the exhausting effort of trying to prove herself to a family that never truly saw her. This laughter, this warmth, this love was what mattered. As the night wore on and the kids started to yawn, Rachel tucked them into bed, pressing a kiss to each of their foreheads. Just as she was pulling Sophia's blanket up, her daughter blinked sleepily at her. Mommy? Yes, sweetheart. I like our family. Rachel felt something deep in her chest tighten, something raw and fragile and real. I do too, baby. Sophia smiled, eyes fluttering shut. Even better than Grandma's house. Rachel swallowed the lump in her throat and smoothed Sophia's hair. Good night, my love. As she turned off the light and closed the door behind her, she let out a slow breath. She was making the right choice. She knew she was. But that didn't mean it wouldn't hurt. The next morning, as she sipped her coffee and flipped through her phone, a new message popped up. Matthew, you really need to stop being so dramatic. Rachel's jaw clenched. She had barely gotten through her first sip of coffee, and already, the judgment was pouring in. A second message appeared. Matthew, Mom is upset. You know she didn't mean anything by it. Just come to dinner and stop making this a thing. Rachel stared at the words, anger bubbling beneath her skin. Stop making this a thing? She took a slow, steady breath before typing back. Rachel, it already is a thing, Matthew. It always has been. The difference is, I'm finally done pretending it's not. There was a long pause before 3 little dots appeared, then disappeared, then reappeared again. Finally, a response. Matthew, you're impossible. Rachel let out a dry laugh and set her phone down. Good. For the first time in her life, she wasn't bending. For the first time, she wasn't the one chasing, begging, pleading for a seat at the table. She was choosing herself. And, more importantly, she was choosing them. Hours passed, and her phone remained silent. But she didn't care. She and the kids spent the day shopping for their Thanksgiving feast, letting Sophia pick out the perfect pie ingredients while Caleb insisted on pushing the cart, despite the fact that it was nearly twice his size. They picked out decorations, tiny pumpkins, and even a goofy turkey hat that Caleb proudly wore the entire trip. And for the first time in a long, long time, Rachel felt free. As the sun set and they unpacked their groceries, Rachel's phone buzzed again. She sighed, expecting another guilt trip from Matthew. But this time, it was her mother. Mom, are you really not coming? Rachel stared at the message for a long moment. Then, with a calm she didn't know she had, she typed back. Rachel, no, Mom. I'm not. She expected an argument. A plea. Another manipulation. But instead, 3 dots appeared. Then disappeared. Then, nothing. Rachel let out a breath and turned back to her kids. Rachel sat at the kitchen table, absently stirring her coffee, watching the steam swirl into the air. The house was still quiet, the early morning calm before Sophia and Caleb woke up and filled the space with their laughter and chatter. It had been 3 days since she told her mother she wasn't coming for Thanksgiving. 3 days of silence from her family, except for Matthew, who had sent one final, passive-aggressive text before apparently deciding she wasn't worth the effort. That should have been a relief. Instead, an uncomfortable tension sat in her chest, pressing down, making it hard to fully enjoy the peace she had claimed for herself. She had always been the one to smooth things over. The one to call first, to let go of her feelings just to keep the family together. But not this time. She had made her choice. And if they cared so little about her and her children that they could dismiss them so easily, then they could live with that choice too. A sharp buzz pulled her from her thoughts. Her phone. She glanced at the screen. Mom calling. Rachel's stomach twisted. She could ignore it. But she already knew her mother. If she didn't pick up now, she'd keep calling. And calling. Until Rachel gave in, just like she always had. With a quiet sigh, she pressed accept and lifted the phone to her ear. Hello, Rachel. Her mother's voice was cool, controlled. I wanted to talk to you about Thanksgiving. Rachel closed her eyes briefly. We already talked about this. I know, her mother said quickly. I want to give you another chance to reconsider. Reconsider. As if this were a negotiation. As if she had simply made the wrong choice and now had an opportunity to correct it. Rachel took a slow, steady breath. My answer hasn't changed, Mom. Rachel, her mother sighed, the exasperation creeping in. Be reasonable. This doesn't have to be such a big deal. A big deal. Rachel repeated, heat rising in her chest. You told me my kids weren't welcome, Mom. My children. You expected me to just leave them behind and show up anyway. Her mother hesitated, then quickly backtracked. I didn't say they weren't welcome. I just thought it would be easier if they stayed home. Rachel's grip tightened on the phone. Easier for who? Another pause. Then, softer, like she was the one being wounded, her mother said, I just wanted a peaceful dinner. Rachel let out a hollow laugh. Right. And Matthew's kids are part of that peaceful dinner, but mine aren't. Matthew's children are older, her mother insisted. They understand how to sit quietly, how to behave at the table. They understand how to fit into your expectations, Rachel cut in. Because they always belong there. My kids never had a chance. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Rachel pushed forward. Mom, do you even hear yourself? You're not even trying to hide it anymore. This isn't about Thanksgiving. It's about who gets to be part of this family and who doesn't. That's not fair, her mother said sharply. Isn't it? Rachel shot back. Because it feels exactly like the same thing I've spent my whole life feeling. And I won't do that to my children. I won't let them grow up thinking they have to earn a spot at your table. A beat of silence. Then, her mother's voice cooled. Well, she said, a little too composed, I thought you might be stubborn about this. But I didn't think you'd be selfish. Rachel blinked. Excuse me? I thought, at the very least, you'd think about how this affects everyone else, her mother continued. Matthew is upset. Your father is upset. You're punishing all of us just because you're feeling, what? Slighted? Left out. Rachel's jaw tightened. They always did this. Always twisted the situation so that she was the unreasonable one, the emotional one. Not this time. I'm not punishing anyone, Rachel said evenly. I'm making a choice. A choice to protect my kids from a family that doesn't see them as equals. Her mother sighed again, as if Rachel were a lost cause. You always have to be difficult, don't you? Rachel nearly laughed at the irony. Difficult? For standing up for her children? But she didn't laugh. Instead, she said, clearly and without hesitation, I'm done, Mom. A pause. What do you mean by that? I thought, at the very least, you'd think about how this affects everyone else, her mother continued. Matthew is upset. Your father is upset. You're punishing all of us just because you're feeling, what? Slighted? Left out. Rachel's jaw tightened. They always did this. Always twisted the situation so that she was the unreasonable one, the emotional one. Not this time. I'm not punishing anyone, Rachel said evenly. I'm making a choice. A choice to protect my kids from a family that doesn't see them as equals. Her mother sighed again, as if Rachel were a lost cause. You always have to be difficult, don't you? Rachel nearly laughed at the irony. Difficult? For standing up for her children? But she didn't laugh. Instead, she said, clearly and without hesitation, I'm done, Mom. A pause. What do you mean by that? I mean, Rachel continued, I'm done being the daughter who bends over backward for people who don't care. I'm done pretending everything is fine just so no one else has to feel uncomfortable. And I'm done being the person you expect to always come through, no matter how badly you treat me. Her mother's tone sharpened. You don't mean that. I do. Another pause. Then, a thinly veiled warning. You're making a mistake, Rachel. No, Rachel said, her voice steady. I'm finally doing something right. Her mother let out a breath. Then, just as quickly as she had called, she said coldly, fine. If that's how you want it. And then she hung up. Rachel stared at the phone in her hand, her heart pounding. It was done. No screaming. No long, drawn-out fight. Just done. A breath left her in a slow, shaking exhale. She had expected to feel broken, to feel guilty. But instead, all she felt was relief. For years, she had been the one to hold things together, to swallow her feelings for the sake of peace. But peace had never really existed in her family. It had always been conditional. Now, she didn't have to play by their rules anymore. A sound from the hallway made her turn. Sophia stood there, blinking sleepily, her hair sticking up in wild curls. Mommy, she mumbled, rubbing her eyes. Rachel smiled, setting her phone aside. Morning, baby. Sophia shuffled over and climbed into her lap, curling into her like she used to when she was younger. Are we still making our big Thanksgiving? Sophia asked, voice thick with sleep. Rachel pressed a kiss to the top of her daughter's head, holding her close. You bet we are, she murmured. Sophia smiled against her shoulder. Good. Rachel let out a breath, feeling something settle inside her. For the first time in her life, she wasn't looking back. She was choosing her real family, and she had never felt more free. Rachel sat at the kitchen table, her coffee growing cold as she scrolled through her bank statements one more time. The transactions were all still there, an undeniable, infuriating record of her parents using her like a personal ATM. The hotel stays, the expensive dinners, the shopping trips. It wasn't help they had needed. It was her money. Her stomach clenched as she took another deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. She had already canceled the card, already cut them off financially. She had done the right thing. And yet, as she sat there, trying to process the sheer audacity of her mother's entitlement, her phone buzzed. Matthew. Rachel almost laughed. Of course. She let it ring, debating whether to answer. She already knew how this was going to go. Matthew had always been their golden child, their defender. He'd call to smooth things over, to tell her she was being dramatic, that she was overreacting. Rachel sighed and picked up the phone. Rachel, Matthew said without preamble. Mom just called me. Of course she did. Rachel leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping against the table. And? Matthew exhaled sharply. She's upset. She said you canceled their credit card and refused to help them. Rachel nearly laughed. Their credit card? You mean mine? The one they've been secretly using for years. Matthew groaned. Oh, come on, Ratch. It's not like they were doing anything wrong. Rachel's jaw clenched. Not doing anything wrong? They stole from me, Matthew. They didn't steal, Matthew argued. They just borrowed. Rachel slammed her hand down on the table, her patience snapping. Borrowed? Are you serious? Borrowing implies I agreed to it. They were charging thousands of dollars behind my back. That's not borrowing. That's theft. Matthew huffed. Look, I get why you're upset, but they're our parents. They raised us. They sacrificed for us. Don't you think you owe them something? Rachel's stomach turned. There it was again. That word. Oh! Like she was a debt to be collected. Rachel took a slow breath, steadying herself. No, Matthew. I don't owe them anything. Matthew scoffed. You wouldn't even have a life if it weren't for them. Rachel laughed coldly. Wow. So I should be financially responsible for them for the rest of my life because they, what? Did the bare minimum required of parents? Matthew's voice turned condescending. It's not about that, Rachel. It's about family. We're supposed to take care of each other. Rachel narrowed her eyes. Oh, really? Because I don't see you handing over your paycheck to them every month. Silence. Rachel smirked bitterly. That's what I thought. Matthew groaned again. Look, I called to offer a compromise, okay? Let's just be reasonable about this. Rachel raised an eyebrow. Reasonable? Matthew hesitated, then said carefully, what if you just give them a small monthly allowance? Something manageable. You don't have to give them unlimited access, just a little help. Rachel almost dropped the phone. A monthly allowance? Like she was their employer? Like they were entitled to her money on a permanent basis? Rachel let out a dry, humorless laugh. You really don't get it, do you? Matthew sighed. Rachel. No, she cut in. I'm done. I'm not compromising with people who see me as nothing more than a bank account. Matthew's tone sharpened. That's not fair. Rachel laughed. Not fair? You mean like them spending thousands of dollars of my money without asking? Like them telling me my kids aren't welcome at Thanksgiving? Like them calling me selfish the second I set a boundary? You're being unreasonable, Matthew snapped. Rachel's temper flared. No, Matthew. I'm finally being reasonable. I'm not their fallback option anymore. If they need money, they can figure it out like adults. I'm not their safety net. Matthew was silent for a long moment. Then, in a cold, clipped voice, he said, Fine. Have it your way. But don't come crying to me when you regret it. Rachel smiled. I won't. And then she hung up. For a moment, she just sat there, gripping the phone, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. Then she exhaled, slow and steady. She had done it. She had shut it down. For years, she had let them manipulate her, let them guilt her into giving more and more. But not anymore. She wasn't the reliable daughter. She wasn't the one who would clean up their messes. She was free. Rachel stood up, stretching her arms over her head. She had wasted enough energy on them. From this moment on, her focus was on her real family, Sophia and Caleb. She walked into the living room, where the kids were playing with their stuffed animals, their laughter filling the space with warmth. Mommy! Caleb beamed up at her. Can we bake cookies? Rachel smiled, dropping onto the couch beside them. Absolutely. Let's make the best cookies ever. Sophia gasped. Can we make them in fun shapes? Rachel laughed. As many shapes as you want. And as her children cheered and pulled her toward the kitchen, Rachel felt something settle deep inside her. For the first time in her life, she wasn't chasing love. She was standing firm in her worth. And it felt incredible. Rachel stood at the kitchen counter, kneading dough with deliberate focus. The rhythmic press and fold of her hands helped ground her, giving her something real to concentrate on. The scent of cinnamon and nutmeg filled the air, a comforting reminder that Thanksgiving was close. Her kids were at the table, focused on decorating their homemade place cards. Sophia had carefully written out each name, complete with doodles of smiling turkeys, while Caleb was more enthusiastic with his markers, turning his into a swirl of chaotic colors. It was peaceful. Until the doorbell rang. Rachel froze, her stomach twisting. No one was supposed to be coming over. A sharp knock followed, insistent and familiar. Rachel wiped her hands on a dish towel and headed for the door, already knowing who it would be. She opened it to find her parents standing on her doorstep. And they weren't alone. Matthew and Olivia stood behind them, looking as though they were there to witness some grand intervention. Rachel inhaled sharply, bracing herself. Her mother smiled, holding out a wrapped box. We brought you something, dear. Rachel didn't move. She knew what this was. A performance. A carefully crafted illusion of goodwill meant to put her back in her place. They weren't here to apologize. They were here to fix her. Rachel crossed her arms. What are you doing here? Her mother's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. We wanted to talk. She gestured to the gift, as if that explained everything. A peace offering. Rachel glanced at Matthew, who stood stiffly, his arms folded. Olivia clutched his hand, watching the scene with a neutral expression. She had never directly involved herself in family matters, always content to let Matthew be the one to fight their parents' battles. Rachel turned back to her mother. If this is about Thanksgiving, my answer hasn't changed. Her father, who had remained quiet until now, let out a heavy sigh. Rachel, you're being unreasonable. Rachel's jaw tightened. I'm being clear. Her mother's lips thinned. Honey, we didn't come here to argue. Rachel raised an eyebrow. Then why are you here? Her mother shifted, pressing the gift forward. Just take this and let's sit down. We can talk. Rachel didn't move to take it. She wasn't going to play their game. Her mother exhaled. Rachel, don't be difficult. We're trying here. Rachel let out a hollow laugh. Trying? No, Mom. Trying would have been realizing you were wrong before I cut you off. Trying would have been calling me to say you were sorry, instead of having Matthew guilt-trip me into paying for you. Matthew tensed at that, but Rachel didn't give him a chance to speak. She stepped forward, her voice steady. You're not here because you want to fix things. You're here because you realized you lost control over me. Her mother's face hardened. Rachel, that's not fair. Rachel scoffed. No? What's in the box? Another manipulative little test? A bribe. Her mother's expression wavered, and Rachel knew she had hit the mark. Rachel stepped back, gripping the door. I'm done, Mom. I meant it. You don't get to show up here and pretend everything is fine. Her father, ever the quiet observer, finally spoke. You're being dramatic. Rachel's teeth clenched. There it was. Again. Dramatic. Emotional. Impossible. It was always her fault, wasn't it? She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. You know what? No. I am not dramatic. I am a grown woman, and I am telling you, very clearly, that I want nothing to do with you anymore. Her mother gasped softly. Rachel, you don't get to hurt me, manipulate me, take my money, and then waltz back and like nothing happened, Rachel said, her voice rising. And you sure as hell don't get to exclude my children and then expect me to sit at your damn table like it's nothing. Matthew stepped forward. Rach, come on. Don't do this. Rachel turned to him, her patience officially gone. You mean don't stand up for myself? Don't set boundaries? Don't refuse to let them treat me like a spare daughter? Because that's what this is, isn't it, Matthew? You get everything, and I get whatever's left over. Matthew's jaw tensed, but he said nothing. Rachel exhaled, pressing her fingers against her temple. I've spent my whole life trying to be enough for you people. And the truth is, I never will be. Not because I'm not worthy, but because you never wanted me to be. You needed someone to be the afterthought. To be the backup plan. Her mother opened her mouth, but Rachel wasn't done. And I let it happen. Over and over and over again, I let it happen. But not anymore. She straightened, her shoulders squared. You don't get to use me. You don't get to have my money. You don't get to have my time. And you sure as hell don't get to have a relationship with my kids. A sharp gasp came from her mother, as if that last line had finally landed. Rachel didn't blink. Leave. And don't come back. Her mother stepped forward. Rachel, please, let's just. Rachel slammed the door in their faces. Silence. Her breath came hard and fast, her hands still gripping the doorknob. Then, a muffled voice from the other side. She'll come around, her mother said. She always does. Rachel's eyes burned. Not this time. She turned around and nearly ran into Sophia, who stood in the hallway, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Rachel's heart clenched. Baby, did I wake you? Sophia blinked up at her. Were you fighting with Grandma? Rachel exhaled. She crouched down, brushing a curl from Sophia's face. A little. Sophia bit her lip, then said, She's not nice. Rachel's throat tightened. Her daughter, 7 years old, had seen the truth faster than she had. Rachel wrapped her arms around Sophia, pulling her close. No, sweetheart. She's not. Sophia nuzzled into her, soft and warm. But we're still having our own Thanksgiving, right? Rachel smiled, kissing her daughter's forehead. Of course we are. Sophia grinned. Good. Because I want to make the biggest pie in the world. Rachel laughed, her chest loosening. Then we'd better get started. She stood, scooping Sophia up into her arms. And as she carried her back into the kitchen, she felt lighter than she had in years. Because for the first time in her life, she had chosen herself. A week had passed since Rachel had slammed the door in her parents' faces. A week of silence from them. A week of peace. Thanksgiving had come and gone, and it had been perfect. She and the kids had spent the entire day in the kitchen, making a mess of flour and sugar, giggling as they rolled out pie crusts and mashed potatoes. Sophia had insisted on setting the table just right, carefully arranging their handmade place cards, while Caleb had been more interested in eating the marshmallows straight out of the bag. They had eaten until they were stuffed, curled up on the couch watching movies, and ended the night with an impromptu dance party in the living room. Rachel had gone to bed that night with a full heart, truly knowing that she had made the right decision. Her parents weren't in her life anymore. And she was finally free. Until the letter arrived. Rachel frowned as she sorted through the mail that morning, flipping through a stack of bills and holiday flyers. And then she saw it. A formal legal envelope. Her heart kicked up a notch. She turned it over, reading the return address. It was from her parents' lawyer. Rachel's stomach turned to ice. She carefully peeled it open, unfolded the papers, and scanned the first few lines. Then she laughed. Not a normal laugh. Not the kind that comes from something genuinely funny. No, this was a sharp, bitter, almost disbelieving laugh. Because her parents weren't just angry that she had cut them off. They were suing her. Rachel dropped into a chair, eyes darting over the paperwork. It was an itemized list of expenses, money they had supposedly spent on raising her. Food, housing, school supplies, clothes. Every single basic necessity of her childhood had been neatly tallied up, down to the last penny. And the total? $80,000. Rachel let out another hollow laugh. They actually expected. Rachel gripped the steering wheel tightly as she pulled up to her parents' house, the lawsuit papers sitting on the passenger seat beside her. She had debated whether to come in person or let the courts handle it, but after everything, she needed this confrontation. She needed to look them in the eyes and say enough. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed the legal papers, stepped out of the car, and walked up the driveway. The house looked the same as it always had, a perfectly manicured lawn, the same wreath on the door that had been there since she was a teenager. But now it felt different. Smaller. Less powerful. Rachel knocked. A moment later, her father opened the door. His expression shifted from surprise to irritation in an instant. Rachel, he said flatly. She held up the lawsuit papers. Mind explaining this? His jaw tightened, but before he could respond, her mother appeared in the doorway. Unlike her father, she didn't try to hide her satisfaction. Rachel, you didn't return our calls, she said, feigning concern. We had no choice but to take action. Rachel scoffed. No choice? You actually think you can sue me for raising me? Her mother lifted her chin. It's not a suit, dear. It's a simple request for fairness. We supported you for years. You should be willing to support us in return. Rachel laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. Fairness? Is that what we're calling extortion now? She stepped forward, shoving the papers into her mother's hands. You're not entitled to my money, and you damn well aren't going to get it through the courts. Her mother's face darkened. We sacrificed for you. Fed you. Clothed you. Educated you. That was not free. Rachel's blood boiled. Selfish? She let out a bitter laugh. You stole thousands of dollars from me. And now you're suing me because I finally cut you off? Her mother sighed dramatically. We're just asking for what's fair. Rachel shook her head, her chest tightening. No, you're asking for control. And I'm not playing along anymore. Her mother's eyes narrowed. You're making a mistake, Rachel. Rachel's heart pounded, but she refused to waver. No, the mistake was thinking I'd keep letting you use me forever. Her father finally spoke again, his tone dangerously calm. We'll see what the courts have to say about that. Rachel met his gaze evenly. Yes, we will. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and walked back to her car. She could feel their eyes on her as she drove away, but she didn't look back. She didn't need to. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of them anymore. That night, Rachel sat on her couch, flipping through the stack of bank statements and text messages she had printed out for her lawyer. She had everything she needed to crush this lawsuit. They had no case, no legal ground. But this wasn't about money. This was about power. Her parents thought she would break. That she would panic, apologize, hand them what they wanted just to make this all go away. But they didn't understand. She was done bending. Her phone buzzed. Matthew. Again. Rachel sighed and answered. What now? His voice was clipped. Mom and Dad are pissed. Yeah, I got that, Rachel said dryly. Matthew exhaled. Look, I know they're overreacting, but do you really want this to go to court? It's going to be ugly, Rach. Just talk to them. Work something out. Rachel rolled her eyes. Work something out? You mean cave and pay them off so they don't have to face consequences? Matthew was silent for a beat. It's just money, Rachel. Rachel's grip on the phone tightened. No, Matthew. It's never just money. It's control. It's them thinking they can do whatever they want, and I'll just keep taking it. Well, I'm done. Matthew groaned. Jesus, you're impossible. Rachel smirked. So I've been told. A long silence stretched between them. Then, in a quieter voice, Matthew said, You know they'll never forgive you for this. Rachel's chest tightened, but she forced herself to stay steady. Good, she said. Because I'm done forgiving them. Matthew sighed. I guess that's it then. I guess it is. And this time, she was the one to hang up. The following week, Rachel sat in her lawyer's office, reviewing her case. Her lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Julia, flipped through the paperwork and let out a low chuckle. This is one of the most ridiculous cases I've ever seen, she said. They don't have a leg to stand on. Rachel let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. So I have nothing to worry about? Julia leaned back in her chair. Legally? No. But I'm guessing they're not planning to win. They just want to scare you into settling. Rachel's stomach turned. That's not going to happen. Julia smirked. Good. Because I love crushing people like this in court. Rachel let out a breathy laugh. Glad to hear it. Julia tapped the papers. I'll file a response immediately. This'll be over faster than they think. Rachel nodded, relief washing over her. She had expected to feel afraid. But instead, she felt something else entirely. Powerful. Because for the first time, she wasn't playing by their rules. She was fighting back. And she was going to win. Rachel sat in the courtroom, her hands resting in her lap, her fingers lightly tapping against the fabric of her dress. The air was thick with tension, but she wasn't nervous. Not anymore. Her parents sat on the other side of the room, whispering to each other, pretending to be composed. But she knew them too well. She saw the stiffness in her mother's shoulders, the way her father's jaw clenched. They had expected her to cave. She hadn't. Julia, her lawyer, leaned over and murmured, Relax. This will be over soon. Rachel nodded, her eyes flicking toward the judge as he entered and took his seat. The proceedings began, her parents' lawyer standing and making his case first. Your Honor, my clients provided financial support to their daughter for over 20 years. They incurred significant expenses in raising her, providing her with food, shelter, and education. It is only fair that she repay a portion of those costs now that she is financially stable. Rachel almost laughed. Only fair? The judge raised an eyebrow. Mr. Donahue, are you suggesting that basic parental responsibility comes with a repayment plan? Her parents' lawyer hesitated. We are simply asking for a reasonable contribution. To what? The judge cut in. They were legally required to provide for their child. That's called parenting. Rachel bit back a smirk. Her lawyer, Julia, stood. Your Honor, not only is this claim morally bankrupt, But my client has proof that her parents have already taken tens of thousands of dollars from her without her consent. She slid a thick folder across the table. Credit card records, unauthorized charges, text messages proving they expected continued financial support from her. The judge skimmed the documents, his expression growing colder. He looked up at Rachel's parents. "Do you have an explanation for these charges?" Her mother sat up straighter, attempting to soften her tone. "Your Honor, we only borrowed the money because we were struggling. And she added us to her card voluntarily." Julia didn't let that slide. That was years ago, under the assumption that they would stop using it once they got back on their feet. Instead, they used it like a personal bank account, booking luxury hotels and fine dining on her dime. The judge exhaled sharply. "I've seen a lot of cases, but this is a new one." Parents suing their own child for existing while stealing from her at the same time. He turned to Rachel's parents. "Frankly, this is disgusting." Rachel's mother flinched. Her father looked away. The judge continued, "Not only is this case being dismissed with prejudice, but I am ordering you to reimburse your daughter for the fraudulent charges." Rachel's mother gasped. "What?" Her father's face darkened. The judge wasn't finished. "If your daughter were to take this further, she could press criminal charges for theft. I suggest you count yourselves lucky she hasn't." Rachel almost wished she had. Her mother's face went pale. The judge tapped his gavel. "Case dismissed." Rachel exhaled, a wave of relief washing over her. It was over. She had won. Her parents rose quickly, practically bolting toward the exit, but Matthew stormed up to her. "You really did it," he spat. Rachel arched an eyebrow. "You sound surprised." "You humiliated them," Matthew hissed. "In front of everyone." Rachel smiled. "No, Matthew. They humiliated themselves." Matthew scoffed. "Do you really think you're better than us now?" Rachel's voice was calm. "I don't think I'm better than you. I think I finally see you for what you are." Matthew clenched his jaw. "You're heartless." Rachel tilted her head. "And yet, I'm the one who raised my kids with love." Matthew had no comeback. Rachel stepped past him, walking toward the exit where Julia was waiting. She had spent years feeling small, feeling like she had to earn love. But now? Now, she knew the truth. She didn't need their approval. She didn't need their love. She had her own family. And that was enough. Months later, Rachel sat in her backyard, watching Sophia and Caleb chase each other around with water balloons, their laughter filling the warm summer air. She sipped her iced tea, feeling light in a way she never had before. The lawsuit had been the final straw. Her parents had tried one last time to control her, to manipulate her into playing her role. And she had walked away. There had been no more calls. No more texts. Matthew had gone silent too, though she knew he still spoke to their parents. And that was fine. She had her people now. Her children. Her friends. The real family she had built. A shadow fell over her as Daniel, her husband, stepped onto the patio, holding 2 plates of burgers fresh from the grill. He set one in front of her, then pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "How's the view?" he asked, nodding toward the kids. Rachel smiled. "Perfect." Daniel sat beside her, stretching his legs out. "Think your parents will ever try again?" Rachel shrugged, taking a bite of her burger. "Doesn't matter." Daniel chuckled. "No, I guess it doesn't." Because she had already won. Not in court, though that had certainly been satisfying. But by choosing herself. By choosing peace. By choosing her children over a family that never truly valued her. Rachel set down her plate and called out, "Who wants ice cream?" Both kids screamed, "Me," and ran toward her. She laughed, gathering them into her arms. This moment, this messy, chaotic, beautiful moment, filling her heart. She had spent so long searching for love, trying to prove she was worthy of it. But she had it all along. Right here. And that was all she would ever need. She was finally free.